There's an uncomfortable line in this novel when the character Manako Kaji says, "There are two things I simply cannot tolerate: feminists and margarine." When I first read that sentence, I honestly thought this character was trying to provoke the reader. It felt like one of those statements that is meant to immediately divide people. But the strange thing is that the more I read, the more I realized that this novel wasn't trying to shock us. It was trying to make us uncomfortable in a much deeper way. Hi, my name is Sneha. I'm a reader and I yap a lot. In this video, I'm going to be talking about my interpretations of this book, Butter by Asako Yuzuki, as a reader with a background in psychology. They're not perfect, and that's completely fine. Literature is interesting precisely because it allows us to disagree and see things differently. Also, this video will contain spoilers from the book. If you haven't read it yet, maybe you can come back after you finish reading it. Butter is often introduced as a story about a woman connected to the deaths of several men, but the novel quickly reveals that it is not really about crime. Instead, it becomes a psychological and social exploration of loneliness, desire, identity, and the difficulty of human connection in modern society. Through the relationship between the journalist Rika and the enigmatic Manako Kaji, the novel examines how personal histories, social expectations, and possibly economic structures shape the way people relate to themselves and to others, and why just something as simple as food becomes the language through which loneliness, desire, shame, and identity are expressed. At the beginning of Butter, Manako Kaji is already a person that society has decided to hate. The media describes her as this manipulative, unattractive, dangerous woman who has seduced men, took their money, and surrounded herself with scandals. In many ways, she is presented as the perfect villain for a modern media story. She doesn't fit the traditional image of a sympathetic woman. She isn't beautiful in the conventional sense. She isn't apologetic as well, and she refuses to present herself as remorseful. So it is quickly decided who she must be: selfish, immoral, predatory. Yet when Rika begins interviewing her, Kaji does not behave like a villain. She speaks calmly and confidently about food, desire, and how people should live their lives. Many of her statements initially sound liberating since she refuses to apologize for her appetite. She refuses to shrink herself to satisfy society's expectations. She embraces pleasure and indulgence without guilt. This creates a strange psychological reaction in both Rika and me as a reader. We feel drawn to her confidence, yet something about it also feels slightly unsettling. This tension between attraction and discomfort becomes one of the driving forces of the novel. She's conversational, but at the same time, she refuses to talk about her case with any journalist, even with Rika. And slowly, she starts controlling Rika without her even realizing. There is actually a possible psychological reason why characters like Kaji can feel so mesmerizing. Human beings are naturally drawn to people who seem absolutely certain about themselves. Think about it for a moment. Most of us go through life constantly negotiating with ourselves. We often question our choices. We wonder how we are being perceived. We adjust our behavior depending on the situation. There's always this quiet background voice asking, "Am I doing the right thing? Do I look strange? Did I say something wrong?" Like how I feel right now. I'm quite scared of being judged and get comments that I'm full of shit. Plus, I'm not used to talking to the camera that much. But that constant self monitoring is such a normal part of being human that we almost don't notice it anymore. But then at times, we encounter someone who seems completely free from that. Someone who speaks as if they have never doubted themselves. Someone who eats what they want, says what they think, and seems completely unconcerned about how others might judge them. And when we see someone like that, something interesting happens. They begin to look powerful, not necessarily because they actually have power, but because certainty itself looks like power. And sometimes confidence alone can create the illusion of authority. It looks like freedom. It looks like someone has somehow escaped the internal negotiation that the rest of us are constantly living with. And most of the time, these people are just bullshitting. In social psychology, this attraction is sometimes described as a pull towards what we might call confident identities, people who appear completely settled in who they are. But what makes this dynamic fascinating is that people like this often create a strange emotional effect on others. They make us curious, and in my case, I feel a lot of respect for such people that I often don't see through their bullshit. They make you wonder something that you might not even realize you're wondering. At a certain point, we also start thinking, what would it feel like to live that way? What would it feel like to stop measuring myself against other people's expectations? And the moment when will I shatter those expectations? And that question alone can be incredibly seductive because it promises a kind of psychological freedom. And this is exactly what begins to happen to Rika when she meets Kaji. Rika has spent most of her life carefully managing herself. So when she encounters someone who seems to live outside of that system entirely, she becomes fascinated, not just because Kaji is this enigmatic, mysterious something something, but because Kaji appears to embody something that Rika has never allowed herself to be. Being unapologetic just for existing, I guess. And that kind of certainty, especially when you have spent your life doubting yourself, can feel almost hypnotic. Alright, so what makes the novel so interesting is that it is not just about Kaji, it is also about the person who's trying to understand her. Because Rika, the journalist who interviews Kaji, is not simply an observer standing outside the story, she brings her own emotional history into the process of trying to understand this woman. And this fascination is not just curiosity, it's deeply personal. Rika grew up in a household where she had to mature quickly. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother worked tirelessly to support the family as she started carrying the full weight of responsibility for keeping everything running. And when a child grows up watching a parent struggle like that, they often become extremely capable and responsible, partly because they don't want to add to the burden. They learn to be helpful, to take care of themselves. They become the kind of child we all often describe as very mature for their age. On the surface, this seems like a good thing. These children grow up capable, independent, and reliable, but there is often a hidden emotional cost to that kind of early maturity. Because when a child learns that the most valuable thing they can be is responsible, they begin to learn that their worth is tied to what they can do for others, and other times that can quietly reshape the way a person sees themselves. Rika's relationship with her father also complicates this emotional landscape. He struggled in ways that made him feel distant and unreliable. And since Rika was only a child, she carried a strange sense of responsibility towards him, a feeling that perhaps she should do something more or help somehow. This kind of emotional dynamic is actually quite common in families where adults are struggling. Children sometimes develop parentification, where they begin to feel responsible for managing the emotional world of the parents, the adults around them. And when that happens, sure, the child becomes extremely capable, but they also learn something very important about themselves. They learn to manage their own emotions carefully. They learn to behave correctly. They learn to monitor themselves constantly. So Rika grows up becoming exactly the kind of person society rewards. She is responsible, dependable, and she's self controlled. But there's a question that often grows inside people who have lived this way for a very long time. If my values come from being reliable, would anyone choose me for simply who I am? Not because I'm useful, not because I'm dependable, but because I'm simply desired. And that quiet question begins to shape Rika's inner world in ways she might not even fully recognize. So we can say that she has spent most of her life carefully monitoring herself, her behavior, her image, and the way she presents herself to others. She knows how to behave correctly. But living this way also means constantly adjusting yourself, constantly negotiating with the who you are and the who you are expected to be. So when Rika encounters someone like Kaji, someone who appears to live completely outside of these restraints, it creates a powerful emotional reaction because Kaji seems to embody something that Rika has never allowed herself to be. When someone appears completely unapologetic and when you have spent most of your life trying to be the right kind of person, encountering someone who refuses that entire system can feel incredibly fascinating. And there's a specific mention of Rika's memory of being desired by girls in her school, which becomes quite significant since it gives her a rare feeling of being wanted simply for just existing. This desire to be seen and recognized becomes an important emotional force in her fascination with Kaji. But the novel slowly begins to ask a deeper question. Is Kaji's freedom genuine? Or is it simply another way of her protecting herself? Kaji's psychology is one of the most fascinating and unsettling parts of Butter because this book never gives us a simple answer about who she is. Instead, it slowly reveals pieces of her life through Rika that makes her action more understandable but not necessarily justifiable. At the beginning of the novel, she appears almost myth like. Society sees her as a manipulative woman, seducing men, exploiting their desires, selfish, immoral. But as we get to know her better, we get to know that she is someone who's shaped by deep emotional isolation and early experiences that distorted her understanding of relationships. One of the most significant about Kaji's childhood is that she went through puberty earlier than other girls, and her mother reacted to it with discomfort rather than support. And for many young girls, puberty is already a confusing and vulnerable time. But when the adults around them respond with shame or distance, it can create a very deep scar, like this powerful emotional imprint. And I mean, she was a child and she's supposed to be a child, but her body is already becoming a woman. Instead of learning that her body was normal, Kaji learned that it was something strange or problematic. This early experience can create a feeling of alienation from one's own body and identity. A child may begin to feel that they're fundamentally different from others or that they exist outside social belonging. And this sense of being an outsider becomes one of the foundations of Kaji's personality. Later in her life, Kaji encounters a man who was harassing her younger sister, which was a deeply disturbing situation. But instead of reacting with anger alone, Kaji feels empathy for this guy because he was an outcast. I feel like this moment reveals something important about her. Kaji seems to feel this instinctive connection with people who exist on the margins of society. Because she herself feels alienated, she is able to recognize the loneliness of others who are also rejected. However, this empathy is complicated. It does not necessarily translate into healthy relationships. Instead, it reflects her tendency to connect with people who exist outside ordinary social structures. As she grows older, she develops relationships primarily with older men who become emotionally dependent on her. These relationships often revolve around food, attention, and admiration. Admiration. What is the word? Admire, admiration, admiration. These relationships often revolve around food, attention, and admiration. And from psychological perspective, this pattern suggests that Kaji learned to create relationships through desire rather than vulnerability. Instead of building mutual emotional bonds, she creates situations where other people are fascinated with her. She becomes the center of their attention. Desire becomes the medium through which she interacts with others. But the thing is that desire is unstable. It creates power dynamics rather than equality. This is why her relationships often become intense but ultimately fragile. One of the most striking aspects of her personality is her apparent confidence. She speaks about her choices with absolute certainty. She refuses to apologize for her appetite, her body, or her lifestyle. And that confidence is what mesmerizing. However, the novel lightly suggests that this confidence may not be pure freedom. It may also function as a psychological defense mechanism. People who have experienced deep rejection or isolation sometimes develop a strong identity built around refusing vulnerability or weakness. My cats are fighting. Instead of seeking acceptance, they reject the need for acceptance entirely. By doing this, they protect themselves from the pain of being rejected again. So maybe this unapologetic persona that she has could be both empowering and protective for herself. But one of the most tragic elements of her character is that beneath her confidence, there are hints that she longs for female companionship. At certain points, it appears that she wants a deeper connection with Rika, but when Rika begins to emotionally invest in her, Kachi abruptly rejects her, calling her delusional. And that moment is quite revealing because sometimes when people who have difficulty with intimacy will push others away, the moment when genuine closeness begins to develop, because true intimacy requires vulnerability. And that can feel threatening to someone who has spent their life protecting themselves. Ultimately, Kaji functions as a mirror for other characters in the novel. She forces people like Rika and the reader to confront uncomfortable questions like, what does freedom actually means? Is living entirely according to one's desire truly liberating, or does it create another form of isolation? Kaji embodies a kind of radical self permission, but the novel suggests that desire without connection cannot fully satisfy the human need for belonging. So she's not simply just a villain or a victim. She's someone who has learned to survive through desire, control, and emotional distance because genuine connection was something that she never fully trusted, and her confidence can attract people, but her inability to sustain mutual intimacy ultimately isolates her. And that contrast between power and loneliness is what makes her one of the most complex character in this novel. So one of the most unsettling moments in the novel comes when Rika begins to feel that she finally understands Kaji. Throughout the story, Rika slowly moves closer to her. She tries to understand her past, her motivation, her loneliness, and at times it feels a strange kind of friendship is forming between them as Rika begins to believe that she has seen the real Kaji, but then Kaji just rejects her. So for Rika, that moment was kind of confusing and even cruel, especially after everything that Rika has done for her. Why would Kaji just push her away? Rika finally understands that this could be the reason why these men who were involved with Kaji would have led to take certain decisions which made them unalive themselves. Since Rika is finally able to understand her, perhaps for the first time, Kaji sees someone who is no longer simply admiring her from a distance. Someone is trying to see her as a real person. And that kind of recognition can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who has built their identity around being untouchable. So instead of allowing that connection to deepen, Kaji rejects it. She asserts distance by calling Rika delusional, re establishing the emotional barrier that protects her. In a strange way, it kind of feels tragic because Kaji may know how to attract people, she may know how to create the admiration, but when someone attempts to form a genuine bond with her, she cannot sustain it. Because the very thing she might secretly long for is also the thing that she fears the most connection. And that tension between desire for connection and fear of vulnerability is what ultimately defines a character. This moment also reveals something important about the novel itself, because throughout the story, Rika is trying to understand Kaji, but the novel quietly reminds us that no matter how deeply we analyze someone, there will always be parts of them that remain unknowable. Human beings are complicated, and sometimes people push others away not because they dislike them, but because closeness feels threatening. The way these characters relate to themselves, their desire, their insecurities, and loneliness starts to reveal itself through something very ordinary food. One of the most striking aspects of butter is how deeply food is embedded in the emotional and the psychological landscape of the story. On the surface, the novel appears to be filled with detailed descriptions of food, cooking, eating, structures, the aroma, and the slow melting of butter in a pan. But it becomes clear that food is not simply just nourishment or aesthetic detail. Food functions as a language through which the characters express their relationships with themselves, with others, and the society that they inhabit. In this sense, food becomes kind of a emotional vocabulary. It reveals what the characters desire and how they attempt to negotiate their place in the world. For Rika, food initially represents as restraint. She doesn't care enough about food. She eats from the convenience store. She doesn't cook for herself. It was kind of this unconscious, broader discipline that shaped her life, as food becomes some type of regulation, as eating is not simply about hunger or pleasure. It becomes something that must be controlled. And as she starts eating, she realizes how much she enjoys it, but then she faces comments about how she cannot practice restraint properly, as eating is no longer simply about hunger or pleasure. It becomes something that must be controlled in order to maintain a socially acceptable image. And this kind of reflects something about the modern societies. Food often becomes entangled with identity and self control. The body becomes a project to be maintained or to be managed, optimized, and disciplined. Eating is no longer purely biological, it becomes moralized. One eats correctly or incorrectly, responsibly or irresponsibly. In such an environment, the act of eating begins to reflect one's perceived worth. It is precisely this kind of a structure that Kaji is disrupting. She approaches food with a completely different philosophy. She refuses this restraint. She refuses the idea that appetite should be hidden or be moderated in order to satisfy social expectations. When she talks about butter, about rich dishes, about cooking for pleasure, she does so with this unashamed enthusiasm. This is where butter emerges as one of the most powerful symbols of the novel. Butter is rich, indulgent, and undeniably real, unlike margarine, which is an artificial substitute designed to imitate the taste of butter while appearing healthier or more economical. Butter carries this sense of authenticity. It does not pretend to be anything else. Kaji's rejection of margarine is therefore not merely about taste, because margarine represents substitution, compromise, and the artificial moderation of desire. Butter, on the other hand, represents authenticity. It symbolizes a life lived according to genuine appetite rather than socially acceptable substitutes. In this way, butter becomes a metaphor for desire itself. To choose butter is to embrace intensity, to accept the pleasure. To accept that pleasure may be rich, messy, and difficult to regulate. Margarine represents the safer alternative, something that resembles pleasure and is ultimately diluted. However, the novel does not present this philosophy as purely liberating. Instead, it reveals that Kaji's relationship with food mirrors her relationship with people. Just as she embraces rich, intense flavors without moderation, she approaches relationship through desire and fascination rather than balanced intimacy. Butter is often described as difficult to obtain. There is a shortage. At first, this appears to be a simple background detail about the contemporary Japanese society. Butter also represents genuine nourishment, something that is emotionally satisfying. Its scarcity can mirror the rarity of meaningful connection in the world that the characters inhabit. Modern urban life, particularly in highly developed societies like Japan, is structured around intense productivity, long working hours, economic pressure, and the fragmentation of communities leave little time or energy for the slow cultivation of relationships. People spend most of their prime years working, commuting, and maintaining social roles. And under such conditions, loneliness becomes increasingly common, as this novel kind of suggests that this loneliness is not simply an individual feeling, it emerges from the structure of the society itself. When time becomes scarce, emotional intimacy becomes scarce as well. So, the scarcity of butter, therefore, could reflect a broader scarcity, the scarcity of genuine connection, recognition, and emotional nourishment. And in this context, we can consider margarine, by contrast, to be seen as a metaphor for substitute modern life offers in place of those deeper connections. Artificial forms of satisfaction like work achievement, social media, social appearances, controlled identities, they may resemble fulfillment, but they lack the deep richness of authentic human bonds. Rika's journey through the novel can therefore be understood as a gradual transformation in how she relates to food and, by extension, to herself. Initially, food is something that she has to control in order to maintain this socially acceptable identity. Under Kaji's influence, she begins to experience food differently, as pleasure, as indulgence, as a way of reconnecting with her own desires. But the novel does not end by simply celebrating indulgence. Instead, it moves toward a more balanced understanding of food. By the end of the story, food becomes something that is shared. Cooking and eating together becomes acts of care and generosity. Food returns to one of its most ancient human functions, creating community. I don't know about you, but food has always been this love language of my grandparents and a lot of the older generation. They'll always ask you, would you like to have some food? Would you like to have lunch with us? And we also find that in the communities with family friends, we often just ask each other whether, like, we can have lunch together or something like that. We invite people over. In this sense, the novel suggests that the true meaning of food lies not in control or indulgence alone, but in connection. Food becomes meaningful when it is shared with others. Butter may represent authentic desire, and its richness becomes nourishing only when it exists within relationships that allow mutual recognition, care, and understanding. I think ultimately this novel suggests that hunger is never simply about food. It is about understanding and belonging. And in a world where genuine connections have become increasingly scarce, even something as simple as sharing a meal can become an act of quiet resistance against loneliness. Because in such isolating environments, relationships slowly become functional rather than emotional. People still interact with each other at work and families and social settings, but the space for vulnerability becomes smaller and smaller. But the main question is, what happens when desire becomes the only way we relate to other people? Because desire alone cannot sustain a relationship. It is powerful, but it is also unstable, thrives on fascination, intensity, and distance. It is often the strongest when the other person remains mysterious. She knows how to attract desire, but she does not know how to sustain relationships. This is why the novel ultimately suggests that Kaji's way of thinking is incomplete. Desire is not inherently wrong. In fact, the novel repeatedly shows that denying desire completely, whether it is the desire for food, pleasure, or understanding, can be deeply damaging. But desire alone cannot sustain human relationships. Without empathy, without vulnerability, without mutual understanding, desire eventually becomes isolating. And this is where Rika's journey begins to diverge from Kaji's. While Kaji embraces desire as a form of independence, Rekha gradually begins to rediscover something else, connection. By the end of the novel, food no longer represents indulgence or control. It represents sharing, cooking, and eating together, where she learns to cook for herself and for the other people. Rika begins to move forward towards a world where desire and connection can coexist. And in the end, the novel gently suggests that the richest nourishment in life does not come from indulgence alone. It comes from being seen, from sitting across the table from another person and sharing something simple like a meal, when someone understands you and genuinely appreciative of you being with them. So when Kaji rejects margarine, she's rejecting substitutes, anything that feels artificial or compromised. And in a similar way, her rejection of feminism may not actually be about feminism itself. It may reflect her resentment towards anything that feels like another set of rules telling women how they should live. Because Kaji refuses rules altogether. She believes in living entirely according to appetite. But the novel ultimately shows the limitation of that way of thinking, as the answer is no longer simply about rejecting restraint or embracing indulgence. It is just something more human. Because the real question that this novel is asking is not whether we should choose butter or margarine. The real question is whether our desires lead us closer to the place that we would like to be, where our own desires are not rejected and we don't ignore them, as we still can be connected to other people through mutual understanding and genuine care for each other. So, yeah, I think that's what I'm going to take away from this novel. Do let me know your thoughts about it, and do let me know if you like these kind of videos. I'll try to make more of them so you can subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.